This is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing blue-white in Lost Caverns of Ixalan. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes for appropriate patrons. So, as you may know, blue-white and blue-red are basically tied for the best performing and most drafted decks in this format. Early on, I was kind of thinking of the aggressive decks as centering on, or the artifact decks as centering on red and being aggressive. That's kind of true, but blue-white is also very good. The blue cards are strong, so apparently the blue portions of the Jeskai section, white-red is slightly the weakest of them, but they're all pretty good. As I see it, there are basically two distinct strategies available to blue-white. There's an aggressive flyers approach and an artifacts control approach. I think both are pretty good. I think they have a decent amount of overlap. I mean, you're going to play the good cards in your decks, but I do think that you want to prioritize things in pretty different orders depending on which deck you're playing. But, you don't want to be so focused that you don't take a good card because it doesn't perfectly fit your plan. But you also don't want to play a card that's wildly off plan and not good in your deck just because it has good stats. So I went through and I made a list of commons and uncommons by color that in roughly the order I think that they should be prioritized in each of these strategies. I always get worried if I'm and now I'm just going to read the name of 50 cards in a row. So I'm going to try to sum up. The Flyers deck is, of course, looking for flying creatures like Miner's Guidewing, the 1-mana 1/1 flying vigilance common that makes another creature explore when it dies, and Waterwind Scout, the 2/2 flyer that makes a treasure, and then also the Cloud Guard, the 4-mana 3/2 flyer that makes a 1/1. It's going to depend a little where your deck's at and vary from draft to draft, but I think the aggressive blue-white flyer deck actually prefers Miner's Guidewing to Ultec Cloud Guard. The lists that I made were differentiated by color, and I haven't combined them. I was not specifically saying Miner's Guidewing over Scout. I was listing the top white and top blue common as I think of it. I think Scout's probably the best common for this deck, but I think that... So Ultec Cloud Guard has better stats than Guidewing overall in blue-white. On 17 lands. I think that basically whenever you're looking at the 17 lands stats, I think that you need to imagine that the stats that you're looking at are telling you how they perform in a deck that is less focused than I think you should be trying to draft. And so I think that Ultec Cloud Guard plays better in unfocused mid-range decks, whereas I think in the best blue-white flyer decks, it's more important to have the 1-drop. So I guess my order would be roughly the 3-mana 2/2 flyer that makes a map, Waterwind Scout, followed by the 1-mana 1/1 vigilance, Miner's Guidewing, followed probably by Ultec Cloud Guard, the 3/2 flyer that makes it 1/1, and then Oaken Siren, the 1/2 flying vigilance that taps for mana for artifacts. Then probably Tinker's Tote. Then I don't know. It gets pretty wobbly once you get to the low priority cards, but other cards that make sense in the deck. The 1/2 white creature that puts a +1/+1 counter on something is very nice to follow up a flyer with and make your flyer bigger, especially because a lot of the flyers in this format are 1/1s and 1/2s, and so a +1/+1 counter can be a pretty big deal, which is the same reason that I like both Deconstruction Hammer and Pirate Hat. I think that equipping the flyers is pretty significant. And then I think you also like both Waylaying Pirates, the 3-mana 3/3 that stuns something if you have an artifact, and Shipwreck Sentry, the 2-mana 3/3 that can only attack if you played an artifact this turn. And then also Quicksand Whirlpool, the 6-mana exile spell that can exile a tapped creature for 3 mana. I think those are basically the commons you're looking for. I think the Pirates are mostly, sometimes they get in, you're playing a decent number of artifacts, but mostly these are tempo plays and defend good ground blockers to be able to race the opponent with your flyers. the key uncommons. Zoetic Glyph, in blue-white, it's very hard not to have enough artifacts for Zoetic Glyph. It's the top performing uncommon in the set. Any blue deck that has enough artifacts that you can like reliably cast Glyph on turn 3, it's going to be the best card available, the best common or uncommon available. So I think Zoetic Glyph, followed by Spyglass Siren, which is the 1/1 that makes a map, followed by Runelurker Bat, which is the 1/1 flying lifelink vigilance for 1, followed by Guardian of the Great Door, which is the 4/4 flyer for 2, where you have to tap 4 things, followed by probably Staunch Crewmate over Spring-Loaded Sawblades. I think Spring-Loaded Sawblades, which is the 5 damage to a tap creature. Staunch Crewmate is the 2/1 that finds a artifact or pirate. Those things are like pretty close. I think I would give the nod to the Crewmate, but it kind of depends on how many misses you have. Clay-Fired Bricks and Lodestone Needle, I think, are pretty close and a little bit behind those. Clay-Fired Bricks is the thing that searches for planes and transforms to give all your creatures +1/+1 and make 2 gnomes. That's better in the control decks, but it's a good enough card that you'd want to play it in your flying decks. Lodestone Needle is the tap a thing that can flip to make your stuff explore. I think that one's actually better in the flying decks because tempo matters a lot more, and making flyers explore is very good. Kinjali's Dawn Runner's pretty good. I think probably better than Chart a Course, Market Gnome, Duskrose Reliquary, and then Malamet War Scribe is somewhat desirable for some of these decks if you're very heavy on flyers. That's most of the cards you're looking to make your decks out of. That was ignoring gold and colorless cards, but I don't think Master's Guide Mural, the 5 mana make a 4/4 that you can craft to get an artifact that taps to make 4/4s. I think you generally want to play it, but I think it's a lower priority than like a decent flyer in the archetype. But of course, the more you blur the line and the less very focused on an aggressive deck you are, and the more you kind of shift into mid-range, the more you want Guide Mural. And certainly if it's like somewhere in pack 1, you want to prioritize the Guide Mural pretty highly and then maybe shift into being a more controlling deck to take advantage of the Guide Mural. Also, I think in general it's a little bit easier to get the control version of the deck, whereas I think that like your colors have to be pretty open and things have to be going pretty well for you to get enough flyers for the flying version of the deck. I did trophy with a blue-white deck that had like 13 flyers, and it felt very good. But I think that most of the time that's a little bit harder to get. So the artifact control deck, I think here, so Waterwing Scout I think is still just the best card, or the best common. But I think, I could be wrong, but I suspect, depending on which synergies you have, that Tinkerer's Tote might actually become the best white common for you. And it's possible that Petrify is better than Ultic Cloudguard. You're really looking for, cheap plays and good answers. Skipping ahead a little bit to some other stuff that I think is just good to keep in mind while I'm talking about this order. First of all, successful blue-white decks, like looking at like decks that trophied and stuff, successful blue-white decks typically have very, very, very low curves. Lots of 1 and 2 mana cards. And that makes a lot of sense because you have a lot of like cantrips and crafting, and so the decks are really, really good at spending mana throughout the game, especially once you get to the very late game where you have enough mana for your 6 and 7 mana craft abilities. And so before that, you want to be sure that you're spending all of your mana and curving out and casting 2 spells a turn so that you don't still have cards clogging your hand at the point of the game where you want to be spending mana to craft your stuff. So for that reason, I think you really want to prioritize cards that cost 1 or 2. These decks, I think, are a lot weaker if you just like have a lot of 4-drops. Also, blue-white control is in the relatively unique position in this format that because it doesn't care about descend and its artifact synergies are like present, but you don't need a ton of artifacts. If you just have some like puzzle doors and Tinkerer's Totes, you'll be able to have artifacts that you need to satisfy your crafting requirements, and beyond that, you don't need like a particularly high raw artifact count. And so, because your types are a little less prescribed than the types in a lot of decks, you can afford to like play more instants. And since that's unusual, what ends up happening is you get a lot of like very premium interactive spells much later than you would expect to get them in other formats. So blue-white control is in a position to really take advantage of like Out of Air, which is a pretty good counter spell, and Unlucky Drop and Brackish Blunder and Quicksand Whirlpool and Petrify, and just get all of these cards, I think, a little later than you would get similar cards in formats that had like different priorities among the other decks. So your blue-white decks can actually be like really good control decks, which is why I think that it's easier to get the control deck than the flyer deck, just in terms of like there are a lot of aggressive decks in the format, and all of them want the efficient flyers. But there are very few, like not all of the control decks want the instant speed control tools. So you can build a deck that like uses the instant speed control tools really well in blue-white specifically. So therefore, I want to just like prioritize, these like good interactive spells that let the game go a little bit longer, so that I can take advantage of my crafting and my better interaction. Inverted Iceberg and Aroused Puzzle Door are really high priorities. Inverted Iceberg is just a really strongly aimed card that I've seen end a lot of games in like the blue-white control deck's favor. And then Puzzle Door is just a really good enabler for your craft stuff, while also giving you decent selection and churning through your deck. Puzzle Door is also like a pretty good way to like help work towards smoothing out a splash. Obviously, control decks are relatively good at splashing, so it can help there. Also, if you do end up with any descend stuff in your deck, it's a really good way to enable that, because it can usually put 2 permanents in the graveyard if you want it to itself, and then you look at 2 cards and you choose the permanent to go to the graveyard and the other one to go to your hand. The more totes you have, the better Adaptive Gem Guard gets. Adaptive Gem Guard has relatively poor stats on 17 lands. This is the 4-mana 3/3 that you can tap 2 things to put a +1/+1 counter on it. I think it's very easy for this card to be good enough that someone could justify putting it in their deck, and therefore I think its stats indicate its performance in decks that don't use it to the best of its ability. I think that if you have like a lot of Tinkerer's Totes, it's quite a bit better. And then if you have a way to like get it past opposing like 1/1 Death Touch creatures, it gets much better than that. And so if you have a lot of Tinkerer's Totes, I think it's good to have just 1 or 2 Adaptive Gem Guards. They play really poorly in multiples, but then if you have Adaptive Gem Guard as part of your game plan, then Otaklan Landmark, the 1-mana artifact that scries 2 and can transform into a 1/4 flyer that can like jump another attacker, is a really, really good way to kill your opponent with Adaptive Gem Guard. And then also like it plays well because it's just a 1-mana artifact that sits in play, scries up front. And so I think that like Tote is the card that's going to be pretty good regardless. And then the more Totes you have, start looking for Gem Guards. And then if you have a couple of Gem Guards, stop taking more Gem Guards and start taking Landmarks. Landmark is potentially playable if you don't have Gem Guard. Like a 1/4 flyer is a decent defensive creature, and if you have like some puzzle doors such that you can craft with it pretty early, it's like a reasonable defensive tool. I don't like it in like really aggressive decks because I think it's hard to craft with it in a timely fashion. But when you have like some big ground creatures that you're interested in giving flying to, and you can use the just like 1-mana artifact being in play, then I think it starts to like form a compelling package. Shipwreck Sentry, the 2-mana 3/3, can't attack unless you play an artifact. You're playing a lot of artifacts, so it can often attack. You also usually don't care if it can attack in your control deck. You're pretty happy to just play a 2-mana 3/3 defender. Attentive Sunscribe is the 2-mana 2/2 artifact that scribes when it becomes tapped. I think it's pretty filler, but it's a cheap card, and those are nice, and it plays well with Adaptive Gem Guard. I think it's probably worse than Cogwork Wrestler. I've moved up a little on Cogwork Wrestler from when I made these notes. I would say Cogwork Wrestler is probably behind Shipwreck Sentry and above Unlucky Drop in this archetype. And then you're looking for, some mix of Unlucky Drop, Brackish Blunder, and Out of Air, but you don't need to take any of those early because so few people want them. But it's not bad to have a bunch of that stuff. The more you're doing the Gem Guard thing, the less you want Unlucky Drop because it's another 4-mana spell. And then you also have access to Oltec Archaeologists, the 5-mana 4/4 that can return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand, or Scry 3. This one you want to be careful about because it's an expensive spell, and I mentioned these decks do well if they have a low curve, but the more, really high-value artifacts you have, the more you want it. Also, it's a way in blue-white to get back a Hoverstone Pilgrim. And blue-white, as I'm going to talk about, can kind of do the Hoverstone Pilgrim thing sometimes. And then Soaring Sandwing, the white land cycler, is better than the blue land cycler. Both land cyclers are fine. And then the 3-mana 3/3 that can make 1/1s is a fine thing to have 1 or 2 of as a late game mana sink. I think Caves play well in blue-white control because you do have the Puzzle Door and the Iceberg that put them in the graveyard, and your uncommon on-color payoffs are potentially really good. Benthesor is very easy to make very good, and the Bat Cave is actually really strong if you have a lot of caves. And then, of course, because of your card selection and the fact that you're playing a blue control deck, splashing is pretty easy, so you can play the color-fixing caves and play off-color cave payoffs. So I do think blue-white control is a good home for a splashy cave deck, and so I'm going to be taking random common caves over cards that are off plan, just to position myself to take advantage of some of the uncommon payoffs. As for uncommons in the blue-white control deck, Zoetic Glyph is probably still the best, but I think Clay-Fired Bricks gives it decent competition in the really control decks. Glyph's still probably better, but Clay-Fired Bricks is really, really good. And then also Master's Guide Mural, Scampering Surveyor, Hoverstone Pilgrim are all high priorities. Not necessarily higher priorities than Spring-Loaded Sawblades and Spyglass Siren. All of those are, top tier super premium cards to me. And then a little bit behind that, you have Staunch Crewmate, which is the 2/1 that finds an artifact or pirate. This one drops a little bit just because I'm expecting to have a few more instants and therefore a few more misses for the crewmate, but that all kind of depends. Duskrose Reliquary and Market Gnome and Guardian at the Door are all really good here. Bat Colony, again, high ceiling. Benthesor, generally pretty good. Confounding Riddle plays really well here. That's the counterspell or impulse that puts the cards in your graveyard. Lodestone Needle, I think, is much worse in this than it is in the aggressive deck, but it's still a playable card. And then the uncommon 1/4s in both colors, Dauntless Dismantler and Hermetic Nautilus, are reasonable, on-plan cards that I think are fine, but a little fillery. I'll usually play them, but I don't, they're not going to make or break the deck in any way. As mentioned, some versions, either deck really, the flyer or the control deck, I think it's a better fit in the control deck. The Gem Guard package, that the Gem Guard plus Tinker's Tote plus Landmark plus a little bit more highly prioritizing icebergs and stuff to have more objects in play, and then if you end up with a lot of the blue creatures that make maps or whatever, that gets a little better. So maybe you happen to have 2 Spyglass Sirens and 2 or 3 Waterwind Scouts, and then you're oh, I'm going to have these maps sitting around if I want, so maybe I'll play this Gem Guard in my flyer deck, and then maybe I'll play this Landmark. So I think that, that package can go in either deck regardless. The synergy makes the individual cards strong enough that they play well regardless of your deck's strategy, because the fundamental game plan there is kind of mid-rangey. Like, you get a bunch of like stats, like you're basically just making a bunch of numbers, and the numbers can attack or block, and it all just kind of works out. So yeah, that package, again, pretty flexible. I mentioned that I like to have caves. If I'm caves, I'm more likely to splash. If I'm splashing, I'm more likely to cave, because the cards that let me splash also enable the cave stuff. And then the more cave stuff you have, the more you're interested in the artifacts that mill you, like Puzzle Door and Iceberg, because when you mill a cave, it counts towards your cave count, and also those cards kind of help, well, especially the Puzzle Door, kind of helps glue your mana together. So that's like another kind of like pocket direction you can, like, that, you know, opens up some cards that you might care about more than you otherwise would. And then the more self mill you have, and the more removal you have, and the more card draw you have, the more you want Hoverstone Pilgrim. So once you like get into the like cave direction, you start wanting self mill, and then you start wanting Hoverstone Pilgrim, and then you're kind of like a multicolored blue Hoverstone Pilgrim deck. But you can, you know, kind of like shift gradually into that space, prioritizing, you know, the cards that are like one step further on the chain of, because I have this, I want this, because I have this, I want this. And I think I talked more about like variation in the control deck, because I think that there is more variation in the control decks. Like, I also think that the stats suggest the average drafting public understands the aggressive decks better than the control decks. I think the aggressive decks are pretty straightforward. You know, take flyers, take some ways to pump them up, take a bit of removal, attack your opponent. I think like figuring out, oh, the control deck gets to prioritize these cards that don't necessarily perform well because the performance isn't understanding the like unique position of this deck, speaking to things like Out of Air and Quicksand Whirlpool, and then also understanding, oh, the control deck actually wants a really low curve, and like draw 3, discard 1 sorcery that might be good in a lot of control decks isn't necessarily good in control decks in this format, because you have a lot of like cards that have craft abilities that let you spend the mana on, so you don't really need to put more cards in your hand because you already kind of have these like spells in play. And then it's better to like supplement that with caves than with dedicated card draw spells if you're worried about flooding out. So I think that there are a lot of ways to kind of approach the control decks the wrong way, so they get a little more focus here. And also, like I said, I think the aggressive cards are a lot more contested, so I think that it's like, I think you get more value out of looking for and understanding the control deck in terms of like how often it's going to come up in the draft. And I guess I should comment a tiny bit more on Cogwork Wrestler, just because I think I was underrating it even today, like knowing that it's good, when I was like thinking about how I'd rank the cards in these decks, before looking at the trophy decks. And like there were a lot of trophy decks that just had like 3 Cogwork wrestlers or so. There was, by the way, I saw one trophy deck that was just totally awesome. It had the rare 1/5 that looks at 2 cards and puts 1 in your hand when you play an artifact, with 4 Cogwork Wrestlers and 3 Icebergs, and then it had Hoverstone Pilgrim. And so the wrestlers meant that it was really, really good at triggering the 1/5 on the opponent's turn. And so then it could just churn through its deck really, really quickly. And I just loved everything that deck was doing. So if you recognize that as a deck that you drafted and you're listening to this, kudos, that deck was sweet. And outside of, you know, the synergy with that 1/5 rare, I do think that the death touch creatures in this format are pretty good, and the creatures in this format often tend to like just be pretty similar sizes. So Cogwork Wrestlers ETB as a trick pays you off pretty often, and then it's also just like 1 amount in play, artifact creature, really helps with like double spelling, and the early game tempo positioning in this format really goes a long way to putting you in a spot where you can take advantage of your like crafting and stuff in the late game. So I do think you really want to prioritize those like really efficient plays. And I think Brackish Blunder, for example, exists in a pretty similar space. The 2 mana unsummon that makes a map if it bounces a tap creature. So all that said, that's kind of the speech or lecture or whatever that I prepared. So I'm going to turn it over to chat for questions. So any questions you have, enter now. And while I'm letting people get those in, I want to thank the newest patrons of the podcast at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. So thank you to DW Chief, Mayhemesque, Devantoy, Joe, and Dolo. Really appreciate it. A lot of support this week. Means a lot to me. So thank you very much. If anyone else is interested in supporting, giving back to the podcast, getting some benefits, access to notes and my drafting, my 17 land stats and coaching discounts and stuff like that, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Also, I guess while I'm on the subject, I did last week say that I would be putting the topic up to a poll for patrons this week. I didn't do that. I was wrong. I imagined that I would have more experience with more different archetypes between the last episode and this episode, and it turns out that I continue to get past cards that make me want to play black decks over and over, and so I didn't have enough experience with enough variety of archetypes to feel comfortable about talking about enough different things to make a poll. So I will keep an eye out for when I feel differently than that, and we'll see what happens. All right, so getting to questions. How do you value Lodestone Needle in the control version? It's an efficient play that like both buys you time and gives you like a late game engine. So I think it's reasonable in the deck, but I don't think it's like very high value. So I value it like on my list. I have it behind Confounding Riddle and ahead of Hermetic Nautilus. So I value it below premium uncommons, where I think it is kind of a premium uncommon, or like second tier uncommon for the aggro decks. I guess it's like a third tier uncommon for the control decks. I don't know how well that answers the question, but playable but not a priority, I guess, is really what it comes down to. For the aggro flyers archetype, so you're established in aggressive flyers, pack 3, pick 1, Abuelo or Bricks, or not, it should neither. Abuelo is incredible. I would take Abuelo. Obviously, you know, you're going to have a lot more context by pack 3 about exactly what things you have to blink and how valuable they are. But it's also just a 3 mana 2/2 flyer with Ward 2. And it's really hard to not have a deck where you can get pretty good value out of activating it in blue-white. And even if you're at a point where you don't have great value going into pack 3, there are a lot of cards you can like move up your prioritization level very slightly to make Abuelo good. So I would expect that I would almost always be taking Abuelo there. I've been having good experiences with Might of the Ancestors and aggro flyer decks. What are my thoughts on it? Interesting. I have not ever really considered putting it in my deck. I do think that like an aggressive flyers deck is a place that makes more sense to play it than most places. This is the 3 mana enchantment that gives a creature +2/+0 and vigilance. I don't remember if it has to attack alone to get that. I guess it doesn't make a lot of sense that it would. I haven't seen the card in play, so I can't be sure. Skeptical, but wouldn't say it's definitely wrong if you've had good experiences with it, but I don't have a lot to add on it. How do I evaluate the 5 mana blue-white artifact that makes a 4/4? I think it's great in the artifact control deck, like premium, like one of the best uncommons, and like acceptable but unexciting playable in the like aggressive flyer deck. How good are the small flyers in the control version? So I think that you generally are not looking to play super low impact cards like Miner's Guidewing in the control version, but the fact that you can just kind of like chump block with it, and then if it draws a card, it basically like cycled into play and gave you some life, means it's like not the worst card, and like you do want to have a low curve, and it does contribute to that, but like it's pretty low impact for a deck that's like trying to play a very long game. Something like Spyglass Siren, I think, is just fantastic regardless. But Miner's Guidewing, I have a little bit less faith in. And similarly, like Rune Lurker Bat, I think is one of the best uncommons in the flyer deck, but like I'd be a little disappointed to play it in the control deck. So there's certainly, I mean, I wouldn't be that sad to play it, because especially like if you have a bunch of like puzzle door type cards where you're going to be able to like get some scries out of its descend, you could get like some use out of it. But I would say that they go from like, like I'm not looking to pass this card, like when I see it I'm expecting to take it in the aggressive decks, to, well, I guess I'll take this if there's nothing else, and it might make my deck, but it probably won't, I guess, is my answer to like small flyers, meaning 1/1 flyers in the control version. How playable is Whirlpool in the more tempo-oriented versions of blue-white? I hadn't really considered it. This one, the more of your creatures have flying, the better it is, because like, so if you have, like if you include like the Tote Gemguard package in your flyer deck, then the Whirlpool is pretty bad because your opponent might have trouble attacking you on the ground. If your deck is basically just all little flyers and you're racing in the air while your opponent's attacking you with their dinosaurs on the ground, then having a 3-mana removal spell for their attacking dinosaur is great. So I think that there's a pretty wide range of how successful Whirlpool can be in the like aggressive blue-white decks. But yeah, the really, like, the fewer non-flyers you have, the better it is. So if you're like a low creature control deck, it's very good. And if you have a lot of flyers, it's very good. And in general, if you're like not concerned with attacking your opponent ever, so they're going to have to attack you at some point, then it's pretty good. But it's not that those situations don't not all decks fit into one of those situations. So there are tempo decks that don't want it, but blue-white is a good home for it, broadly speaking. Question about when do you decide to play the control version? I can see a case where you're picking aggressive stuff and then get shut out, creating a dirtily deck. Yeah, so like I said, for me, I think that I would generally expect it to be easier to get the cards for the control deck. So I tend to kind of expect that that's where I'm going. I've also found that in this format, I like to have a low curve deck that's designed to establish and create inevitability. And so drafting for the control deck, while basically my baseline is expect that I'm playing the control deck and trying to have an inevitability, but also take the premium flyers highly, and as I get flyers, if there continue to be flyers, continue taking flyers, and then accidentally fall into the aggressive deck. So I guess you're kind of framing it as, oh, this is an aggressive format, the aggressive deck's really good, so I'm going to try to draft the aggressive deck. I would start the other way. I would say it's more likely that I'm going to end up in the control deck because the tools for it are available more often. But if the cards for the aggressive deck happen to show up late, then I can seamlessly pivot into that. If you want to approach the format due to like how you're more comfortable playing or differences in how you evaluate cards or whatever, if you want to start by planning to be the aggressive deck, unless there's a reason to draft the control deck, then I would say that the thing that should tell you to draft the control deck is getting premium uncommons for the control deck, like the Guide Mural and Clay-Fired Bricks and Spring-Loaded Saw Blades, these kind of like late-game defensive craft artifacts that play better in the defensive deck. So I think that's gonna wrap us up here. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and to any Americans that are listening to this at the time of recording, happy Thanksgiving, and enjoy your week, and I will be back next week for another episode. Bye for now, everyone.
Prepare for light speed.